everyone. So today I'm going to be presenting my article titled Agency Mechanics, Gameplay Designs in Survival Horror Video Games. So this article's authors are Chad Habel and Ben Cumin. This was published in the Journal of Digital Creativity in 2013. And this article specifically introduces agency mechanics as a key design element in survival horror games, examining how they shape player control and fear. It also compares horror films to horror games, showing how cinematic techniques have evolved in interactive media. Another major focus of this article is this idea called the gaze, which is referring to players shifting between empowerment and vulnerability. As well, it uses the game Dead Space as a case study to explore how games strategically give and take away control to heighten tension. And ultimately, it argues that managing agency mechanics can enhance horror gameplay and offer insight for future game designs. So key definitions that are important to know in this article is first, agency mechanics. So this is going to refer to gameplay design choices that either limit or grant player control. So in survival horror games specifically, they tend to intentionally restrict control, resources, and movement to make players feel vulnerable. There's also a push and pull between autonomy and restriction, which is very central to the horror game experience. The next definition is gaze, which this is going to refer to how players see and experience a scene. So a sadistic gaze is considered, the player is strong and can kill enemies, and a masochist gaze is going to be the player is helpless and must run or hide. So first, there's a section that highlights how horror games basically build on techniques from horror cinema, but horror games now enhance fear through more interactivity and player agency. So unlike films where viewers shift between different perspectives, so consider like watching the view from the killer or the victim or other views, horror games tend to restrict that perspective to the player's avatar, making fear more personal and immersive for the player. This relates also to a gaze in horror, which explains how horror games reduce the multiple viewpoints of film and instead create direct identification with the player's character. So the game, as mentioned, uses the game Dead Space as a key case study. So for displaying the shift players experience between feeling powerful and feeling powerless to heighten fear and immersion. So the game tends to restrict player autonomy in key moments, forcing players into tense and overwhelming situations. Dead Space limits also how much freedom players have to fight back, reinforcing that sense of survival. So when it comes to empowerment, this is when players feel in control, such as when they have weapons, resources, or can fight back against enemies. And when it comes to vulnerability, this is when the game takes away control, like giving them scarce resources, enemies overwhelming them, or scripted events that force them into danger. So this is basically the meat and potatoes of everything. So the specific mechanics that can really manipulate player control. So some of these were mentioned. So for instance, in environmental and gameplay restrictions, limited resources, so scarce ammo, health, weapons, making the players feel vulnerable, different things like a diegetic interface. So for instance, in the game Dead Space, the HUD exists within the game world. So instead of the player being able to press pause and feel safe, they're also at risk at being attacked when they have that up. Other things can include the movement and combat restrictions. So this is things like strategic targeting. So again, in the game Dead Space, the player has to strategically shoot the enemy to dismember them in order to kill them. Other thing are power imbalances. So sometimes the main character can be slower or weaker than the enemy, or there could be external effects that only impact the main character and not the enemies. Other important things are fleeting agency tools. So the two listed are specifically in Dead Space, so things like kinesis, so allowing players to manipulate objects, and stasis, slowing down time, offering brief control over chaotic situation. Again, these are temporary mechanics. And lastly, there is the tension and player disempowerment, so things like forced perspective control, so players are locked into specific viewpoints to limit awareness, or things like unexpected enemy attacks, often when players feel safe, or increasing that unpredictability. Justification. By analyzing this concept of agency mechanics, this article provides insight into how game design balances player control and disempowerment to enhance narrative impact. And overall, this discussion is relevant to understanding how mechanics can shape player immersion, engagement, and emotional responses in interactive media. From the author's perspective, the takeaway is that agency mechanics can really enhance survival horror by being used as a design tool, and it can increase immersion through emotional engagement and create stronger psychological impacts on the player. And here are the last three discussion questions. Survival horror games often limit player control, but at what point does removing the player control become frustrating rather than immersive? Beyond horror games, what other genres could restricting player control be an effective storytelling tool? And then lastly, if survival horror games had a higher player agency, would it weaken the narrative impact and ability to create fear, or could it enhance immersion in a different way?